Morning. It's my pleasure to welcome you all to the first Provost Forum of the year, and the first of many that I hope will be informative and enlightening and sometimes even entertaining. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Matthew Levey. His topic is Global History from the Big Bang to the Present. Dr. Levey is a professor of history who has been at BSc since 1993. He earned his PhD in East Asian Civilizations and Cultures at the University of Chicago. His areas of academic interest include, but are not limited to, the histories of China and Japan, Confucian, Buddhist, and Taoist traditions, World War II, and wars in the Asia and Pacific. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Levey.
Thank you, Dr. Baer. Thank you all for being here. I actually modified the title since then, and the title is The Second World War and the Search for Its Origins in the Context of the Histories of Civilization, Humanity, the Earth, and the Universe. As a history professor who, of course, is never wrong, what I really want to do is to discuss a variety of ways in which deep historical contextualizing of the Second World War can be seen as a fruitful exercise. So basically what I'm going to do is to explain why I've been obsessed with the idea of having a searching for the origins of the war. If you're analyzing a war, particularly a war of a global nature, such as the Second World War was, and you have multiple ways in which you make the argument that the war came about for this, that, and the other reason. Generally, I have been not terribly impressed with the way in which scholars handle that issue. First, because they tend to often be too narrowly defined in terms of having a Eurocentric view of the origins of the Second World War. And secondly, when they do go deep into the past and entertain interesting and potentially insightful ways of contextualizing it, they veer off into racial and ethnic stereotypes that are based on what I would call the theory of modernization. So that has prompted me to search for origins, and one of the reasons why I want to search for origins is to expand the scope of World War II or Second World War studies. The other reason is this issue of modernization. The issue, the notion of modernization, whatever it might mean, we'll get into that, is the central facet of many of the histories of civilization. And it happens to be the case that when discussing the Second World War, the assumptions of a modernization narrative pervade not only histories of civilization, but histories of the origins of the Second World War. So that means that those two are connected. It also means that the war was a war of empires, and I find deep connections to the history of empires, a pervasive phenomenon in the history of human civilization, also to be a way of linking questions about the origins of the Second World War and questions about human civilization. So the next step is letting go of these modernization assumptions, and one of the critical aspects of the theory of modernization, not in and of itself, but its connection to what might be called Orientalist assumptions. Those assumptions about the nature of societies that exist in what's called the Orient, or it used to be called the Orient. Hopefully nobody uses the word Oriental anymore. And those are assumptions that I think we need to jettison. And when we jettison them, we will find that the history of civilization becomes a history of a China-dominated Eurasia through domination, certainly of the eastern portions of the Silk Road and its maritime influence in the Southwest Pacific and in the Indian Ocean. One could almost think of the Indian Ocean as a China lake, certainly by 1000 or 1200 CE, something that might surprise many people. Well, I also think of the Second World War as a war of annihilation, and the Germans have a particularly good word for this, Vernichtungskrieg. It just rolls off the tongue as something you want to run and hide from. A war of annihilation. The Germans are famous for engaging in such genocidal practices. I would suggest that the Japanese were also engaged in similar genocidal practices, and though they fought for the Allies, the Soviet Union fits into this category as well. I would also suggest that the United States and Britain, while not engaging in genocide, certainly not during the Second World War, we might consider genocide or something the United States and Britain in some ways, other countries such as Belgium engaged in before the Second World War. So I wanted to search for an origin of that too. Where do these genocidal impulses come from? Why do people engage in atrocity? Why do they massacre their own neighbors? Why do they ethnically cleanse? Why do they engage in genocide? I think evolutionary history, we are animals in our destructive capabilities and in our productive and constructive behavior. One of the things I find so compelling in relation to evolutionary science is brain neuroscience. Does a lot to help us explain these impulses, and both for constructive and destructive behavior. And as I continue my search for origins, the connection, particularly in terms of time, between these origins and the Second World War get increasingly large, and of course, as a result, the connections get more and more attenuated. And I'm willing to, and certainly as a thought experiment, I'd like to go back to the Big Bang and have us entertain the notion of a universal or cosmological history, for without the Big Bang is made clear by astrophysicists or modern scientific cosmologists. This along with brain science is one of the areas in which scientists have invaded the turf of philosophy. That without the Big Bang, carbon and oxygen-based life forms simply wouldn't exist. If the Big Bang had occurred differently, gravity had been slightly different, the whole story would have been different. Now, admittedly, that's tenuous, so if you're not willing to accept some sort of deep historical framework there, that's fine. I wouldn't blame you in the least. I have my own doubts about it. But at the very least, given the range of academic disciplines that I'm suggesting are connected here, we can think of this in terms of how to construct a good liberal arts general education program. For me, it's a thought exercise. This is something I've been interested in for quite some time, particularly as we've been modifying our general curriculum. It's something I honestly never really thought about before. But I think that a certain kind of general education curriculum, one that integrates disciplines from the three major areas, humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences, can really come together and do some amazing things. And I'm particularly interested in the kind of general education program that would connect the academic disciplines that frequently do not talk to each other. You know, history and political science, we have conversations. Usually, you know, historians are saying political science is a bunch of hooey. Political science is saying historians is a bunch of hooey, so it's not very constructive conversation all the time, but we do converse. The natural sciences often don't converse with the humanities and vice versa. So that's what I'm going to do in hopefully the next half hour, and leave some time for questions and answers. I'd like to begin the body of what I want to present. About 15 years ago, there was a symposium published in the academic journal Diplomatic History. And the gathering focused on World War II studies. What was the state of World War II studies? And I found the conversation to be rather sterile. Most of the people involved in this were, this is, you know, just a decade or so after the collapse of the Soviet Union. There was this anxiety expressed, palpable anxiety expressed about what has happened to Second World War studies. It seems to have drifted away into obscurity. Nobody's really writing about the Second World War. And my first reaction was, are you kidding me? Everybody writes about the Second World War. It's one of the most popular topics today still. But these historians felt threatened by the growth of Cold War studies. And they were anxious about, well, if the Cold War studies are becoming so paramount in the academy today, you know, maybe that Second World War will no longer be studied and will be somehow forgotten. And I was struck by the notion that they were so obsessed with the link between Cold War studies and Second World War studies that they forgot that maybe there's a really important link between Cold War and Second World War. And in fact, when you really think about it, there's a link not only between the Cold War and Second World War, there's a link between the Second World War and the wars, particularly the wars of imperialism that preceded it. And you get that connection once you recognize that the Second World War was in many ways a replay of the First World War because of the failure of Versailles, the peace conference in 1919, that was meant to ensure that the First World War, which of course wasn't yet called the First World War, was the war to end all wars. It became the peace to begin new wars. So I thought to myself, well, here's an opportunity for a group of scholars to reevaluate the state of Second World War studies, and they didn't do it. And I thought, well, okay, what would be one way of contextualizing the Second World War if the Second World War, as is demonstrably the case, is linkable to the First World War, which was itself a war rooted in the fact that the major players in the war were all empires in competition. And so that suggests to me that you have the possibility of what I would call a trans-war context for the Second World War. At least what some scholars have called a short 20th century, 1914 to 1991. I think I'm more taken with the notion of calling it a long 20th century, going back to the heyday of imperialism, let's say 1875 to 1991. But that's just one possibility. I'm not saying that's the be-all and end-all, but it was an opportunity that was missed, and I was particularly struck by that. My own search for origins comes from that, but more from this whole notion of the modernization theory of human civilization. And the modernization theory basically presumes that the norm of human societal transformation is actually experienced by three countries, which I always find rather interesting. Actually, modernization and the emergence of democracy, the emergence of free market capitalism, the emergence of the modern factory-based industrial system, all of these things are considered part of modernity and really were the creation of Great Britain and a couple of other countries in Europe. And somehow, scholars, certainly in the 19th century and particularly after the Second World War, came up with the notion that this was a universal pattern of historical development that happened only to occur in the West. So it's a very West-centric notion. So all those countries that do not make this transition in the way that Great Britain, France, and the United States did are therefore failures in some sense. Now, it happens to be the case that the focus of the modernization theory is really on Great Britain, France, and the United States, but also Germany and Japan. And right away, you should be saying to yourself, a little bit of Axis and Allies. Okay? The whole point, certainly during the Second World War, was to explain why it is that Germany and Japan somehow screwed up the process of becoming modern. Now, the whole notion of becoming modern is predicated on the notion that goes back to Marx, which is that societies undergo fundamental transformations from slave to feudal, and there's something before slave, we don't even have to worry about that, feudal capitalism, and from Marx, then socialism and communism. For liberal historians of a non-Marxian persuasion, the end is in free market capitalism and democracy. Marx essentially says that's just the penultimate stage. But be that as it may, feudalism is the central factor. Now, whatever feudalism has done that, I'm not going to get into that detail. But the bottom line is that societies are mobile. They're capable of transformation through certain kinds of processes that allow a transformation of a fundamental sort, from slave to feudal to capitalism and maybe to socialism. Germany and Japan did that, but they ended up doing it in such a way that they became fascist, aggressive, warlike powers. The United States, Britain, and France were not warlike powers, which of course means wars of conquest of the imperial sort were not really included in this. So during the war, the general perception was that you have what essentially become the Allies, except for the Soviet Union, fighting the fascists. Both of them are modern. But the fascist modernity is a pathological one, and the modernity of the West is correct and proper, as it should be. Now, in the aftermath of the war, China during the war was was nationalist China. It was what we liked at the time to call Free China. China hadn't become the People's Republic of China, the so-called Communist Red China, hadn't been established until 1949. And with its establishment, the whole notion of an Oriental society becomes a central feature of the modernization narrative. So the modernization narrative up till this point is simply, okay, why did Germany and Japan screw up in their modernization process and become fascist aggressors? Not only fascist aggressors, but brutal fascist aggressors. Now, China becomes significant. Why is it that China and other Oriental societies are becoming modern And they're becoming modern really because of the imposition of Western imperialism on them. These societies, again, without getting into the details of why one society might have the capacity for societal change and one society might not. The basic presumption about Oriental societies is that they have no capacity to change. That what they were back in the Shang Dynasty in 1500 BCE is essentially the same thing in 1800 BC. Which, when you really think about it, is absurd. And why it was not understood to be absurd for so long. Because it's really in my lifetime, I started graduate school in 1978, it's really in my lifetime that these things have changed. So really step one is coming to terms with the modernization narrative, coming to terms with the Orientalist component of that narrative, and jettisoning and recognizing that China and various other civilizations had quite a lot of things that the West had. In fact, we live in a world today, make sure I get to the right page here. No, that's not it. Hold on just a second. Where scholars of Asian history in particular, and global scholars, no longer engage in a West-centric historiography. They are what I would call post-Orientalist and post-modernization. I didn't want to say postmodern. And they put Asia, China in particular, but also the civilizations of the Islamic world and the Indian subcontinent. It's preposterously clear that there was rich scientific and mathematical study in all of these civilizations, technological know-how, technological and scientific investigation and tradition. In other words, the books are there. And for the most part, American Asianists were not reading those books. It was up to a handful of non-American scholars, two of which I would like to name. Joseph Needham, who oversaw a 30-volume project on science and civilization in China, which covers all of the basic sciences and and technologies any civilization would have had, any high civilization would have had circa 1750. 1750 is really where things started to diverge between Europe, particularly Great Britain, and China, the Islamic world, and the Indian subcontinent. So, for example, let's see, let's go to Silkwood. All right, well, Marco Polo's travels will do. Marco Polo's traveling in the 13th century, and he's traveling to the China dominated by the Mongols. And the Mongols, through their conquests, established several khanates, the most important of which is China. And what he witnesses is a vast commercial society. And I'd like to give you some sense. He doesn't deal too much with scientific know-how. You know, the Chinese are known for paper, the compass, and gunpowder. You know, they did so much more. Let's see, I'll give you a little sense of that. So here are the volumes of Joseph Needham's, you know, physics, mechanical engineering, mathematics, paper and printing, military technology, work in progress, spagyrical discovery, invention, historical surveys, civil engineering, nautics, shipbuilding, you name it. Why are people not talking about it? Well, they're talking about it now. But one nice indication of at least the commercial extent can be seen in this scroll called the Qingming Scroll, which literally means traveling upstream along the Huai River. And what this does, you start off in a rural section, gradually you make your way to a village, and look at the ships that are in this along the river. This is serious shipbuilding, nautical capability. And these are ships meant for travel along rivers. I'm not talking about, at this moment, ships that have oceanic capability, which the Chinese had. And I'll show you that in a moment. You can see the development of a town along the shore. And really, as you unroll the scroll, you're actually unrolling it, and that's what I like about this. This is a nice digital representation of the process of unrolling it. You get into the town, which turns out to be urban sprawl, once you recognize that here is the city gate, and the original city is in here. And all of this to the right is urban sprawl. Okay? And the richness of the commerce, and this is a relatively small town. It's the town of Kaifeng that for a variety of reasons became the capital of China for several decades, about 1,000 years ago. Another example that illustrates the potential for commerce, but even more so the realized potential of Chinese technology is a series of scrolls, of which this is just one, showing the Qing Emperor, in this case Emperor Qianlong, traveling to the Venice of China, Suzhou, a city built on water, with rivers flowing through it. And again, we start off in a sort of rural setting. And as we unfold, this is the Grand Canal. Traditionally, the Grand Canal is seen as an expression of the monopolistic power of the Oriental state and its ability to gather all the human and material resources of the empire to build grand construction projects, rather than focusing on the science and technological wherewithal that can pull off a feat like this. And it's just, the Grand Canal, the Great Wall, which unfortunately I hear you really can't see from the moon. And here we get to the city of Suzhou. Okay? Granted, this is idealized, but it is an indication of the level of commercialization and technological know-how that is lost when we stick to a modernization narrative and an Orientalist narrative. You can see the Silk Road connects all of Eurasia. The Chinese empire is at the eastern end, and even when China's empire, and here during the Mongolian period, China's empire dominates, but even when it's not, such as during the Tang, about 300 years earlier, here's the Tang dynasty, but it has all these colonies, these colonial protectorates, and the most important of them go right along the Silk Road. So even when China is in relative, where its imperial presence is less extended, it still is the predominant power in Eurasia. And that gets to one of the points I want to make, and that is, as historians jettison this notion of modernization, they now talk in terms of the coming together of a single globe, the process of globalization. And here, globalization essentially occurs in two basic steps. One, the Eurasian landmass, which is if we include North and East Africa in it, is the area where almost all of the civilizations of the planet emerged. Obviously, pre-Columbian, we have pre-Columbian civilizations in Central and Latin America. But those only get connected to the rest of the globe in the period of Western colonization and Western imperialism. So a China-dominated world is the Eurasian landmass, and that's step one to creating the global world. And then really beginning with Portuguese maritime exploration and colonization, and the Spanish and the Dutch, British, a single global system is constructed. So the Second World War fits into that. It fits into that directly because of empires. And the Second World War was a war of empires. Some empires fully established, trying to prevent the other empires from overthrowing them. And some empires wanting to do the overthrowing. The Axis, the Allies and the Axis, respectively. So I think we learn a lot about how to understand that war by recognizing it's an imperial war. And recognizing that it is as much an imperial war as World War I was, as the First World War was. Now, so that's really, you end up with a sequence of events where Eurasia, gradual growth of all these interchanges, all these forms of interchange, commercial, technological, scientific, cultural, happens throughout Eurasia. Okay, and this happens for truly extended periods of time. And are a dominant pattern until really the late 18th and the 19th centuries. The Western imperialism part of the story begins with the overthrow of the Chinese continental and oceanic empire. The oceanic is indicated more clearly by Marco Polo's travels. He generally traveled on land to get to China, but he came back by ocean. And all of this, from the Philippines through Indonesia, all the way west to the Horn of Africa, were dominated by China's navy, a navy that existed, alas, only until the 15th century, when it was scuttled for a variety of reasons. And this is an indication of the size of the ships that the Chinese had for oceanic travel in comparison to what Western ships. Nina Pinta Santa Maria, I think, is more like Pinta, is more like Pinto. So China had this vast land-based and oceanic empire that was essentially replaced by Western imperial empires. The Western imperial empires were then attacked by Germany in Europe, in North Africa, in Japan, in Asia, in the Pacific. They lost. The United States and the Soviet Union became the dominant post-war empires, and the issue of calling the United States empire, I'm not going to get into that for the moment. And then the collapse of Soviet communism in the Soviet Union creates a new situation of a hegemonic power confronted by powers, China and Russia in particular, but even terrorist states such as ISIL, are also seeking to overthrow. They're the new, what we might call revisionist powers, post-Cold War world, if we recognize that Germany, Italy, and Japan were the revisionist powers of the Second World War. So that's my link between the Second World War and the history of civilization. I also try to link it to evolution, and I have several slides about the evolution of hominid to humans, the brain, the link between the human brain and the chimpanzee brain, primarily to show that we are animals. And when we say that we're animals, we tend to say, well, that's pretty negative. But we're also animals in the sense that our brain is a quantum leap in the growth of capacity from the chimp brain. But the chimp brain enables chimps to communicate in language. They have feelings, they have personalities, they make tools. So my connection between the Second World War and evolution is mostly about that notion of war of annihilation and the propensity for humans to do horribly atrocious things. But it's become clear to me that we also need to understand that the brain is an amazing thing that enables us to do so many constructive things. The Big Bang, universal history. We've done the history of civilization. We've done the evolutionary history of humankind. The Big Bang is universe, the history, literally the history of the universe. And that, of course, is tenuous, but I would like to read something from Bill Bryson, who makes the case that the Big Bang is relevant to the history of our planet. And he says, what makes the whole thing so gratifying, he's writing about the Big Bang, is that the Big Bang made all life possible because the gravitational pulls created were just right. In short, without the proper setting of gravitational forces, no stars, no planets, no Earth, no carbon, hydrogen, helium, oxygen-based life on Earth. What is extraordinary from our point of view is how well it turned out for us. The universe had formed just a tiny bit differently. If gravity were fractionally stronger or weaker, if the expansion had proceeded, that is the expansion of the universe, just a little bit more swiftly or slowly, then there might never have been stable elements to make you and me the ground we stand on, and so forth. Again, that's a tenuous connection to the Second World War, assuming you're even willing to accept evolution and the history of civilization as reasonable. So, given the tenuousness of that, I thought, well, okay, we're dealing with all kinds of academic disciplines, many of them in the sciences, and humanists don't often tread those waters. And I'm really enjoying treading those waters these days. So how do we construct a general education that will educate students for the 21st century, to deal with the problems of the 21st century? Now, for me, I'm looking at two things. One, I want a general education curriculum where at least the level of the course, if not the level of the curriculum itself, but certainly at the level of the course, disciplines that are widely separate meet and engage in fruitful teaching. So a course on the Big Bang and history. Literature of evolution, where evolutionary texts, let's say Darwin and others, pre-Darwinian writers, are read, and some of the experiments are conducted, and some of the observations are made in a single class. That's one thing I want. I would love for that kind of academic program. Because that's really what liberal arts, in my mind, means. You engage not simply in some basic, well, you gain not simply some basic knowledge of, let's say chemistry, I'm going to take chemistry 101. But you take something that's very pointed and very specific and pitched at a very high level, where you're dealing with fundamental issues of scientific observation and practice, scientific knowledge. And doing so in a class that also engages the humanist just as much as it engages the scientist. But also doing so in a way that is that encompasses the civilizations of the world, not simply Western civilization, but the civilizations of the world. And I noticed I haven't done a full study of this, but I kind of tooled around a little bit, and I found a couple of really good examples of things that worry me and things that I find very compelling. First of all, this is Shimer College, which is a small Christian college in Illinois. And there's nothing in here that would suggest anything outside of the West. And the irony of ironies is that their integrated studies component is not integrated. You'll take some philosophy, you'll take some history, and you'll take some science, but you won't take a course where philosophy meets science, where history meets science, okay, where literature meets science. Okay, I found that kind of strange. But St. John's College has a 4-year program where you do all this stuff in literature, philosophy, theology, history, stuff, and all these texts, these scientific texts, that's the freshman year, that's the sophomore year, mathematics, so if we just highlight that. And then the junior year, the math and science, they're doing these guys. And then the senior year, that was the senior year. Oh, here it is, Faraday, Lobachevsky, and so forth. Now what's interesting is that in and of itself, that doesn't necessarily suggest an integrated curriculum, as they claim here. But it's when you get to the lab. In other words, when you read all these very scientific texts over the course of the history of Western science, you repeat the experiments that the scientists you read did. So you are integrating a scientific mode of analysis with the literature of science. In other words, you are integrating science and the humanities, or science and the social science. You'll also see history and social science as well. So the long and short of what I'm trying to suggest, everything I've talked about today is not about World War II in and of itself. Really what I'm talking about is how to think about World War II or the Second World War in the context, in larger historical contexts. And to me, a trans-war context is a great place to start. You go from a trans-war context to a context in the history of civilization, to a context of evolutionary history of flora and fauna, including, most especially, obviously, hominid to Homo sapien, and even the Big Bang. And having covered all of that, if you accept the Big Bang, or if you accept any of these, great. If you don't accept it, at least there is some way of understanding that Second World War studies are greatly enhanced by the study of everything. The curriculum should cover everything. I know that's an ideal, but the curriculum should cover everything. Anyway, I've talked beyond 40 minutes, so let's open it up for questions. Yes, Mark.
Matt, you use the term high cultures,
Yeah.
and that these pointed out how these, as you described it, other high cultures have been ignored.
Right.
How do you define high culture, and is high culture your definition a Western definition?
Well, I guess high culture is the wrong word. Civilization is the word I really should have said. Civilizations consist of a variety of things: political forms, writing, some measure of control of the environment beyond simple tribal control of, a limited resource base, where you get to the point where you can actually create large construction projects. The first wall building in China was 2,400, 2,300 years ago. So there's clearly scientific and technological know-how that exists in China as early as, 2,500 years ago. That's what I'm referring to. Those general kinds of characteristics.
But it seems like you're comparing, in a sense, and saying China was in some way better off or a higher culture than Europe
For periods
For
of,
a- for a period of time.
Yes, that's true. China was commercially far more advanced
Sophisticated.
and sophisticated, technologically far more advanced than medieval Europe. Comparable,
And much more than Africa.
oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's right. But I'm not, you might make a good rough comparison between China of the Han Dynasty, let's say 200 BCE to 200 CE, and the Roman Empire. But the comparison Europe doesn't do so well in the comparison between China of, let's say, 1000 CE and Europe of 1000 CE.
I guess what I'm getting at is, what are we supposed to draw from this? Are we supposed to say they were better than the Europeans during this
No, we're
time
supposed to
period?
draw from this that there are patterns of historical change where China was a predominant power, probably the single most important predominant power up until the 16th and 17th centuries, where everything flipped. And one could make the case that a reflipping is taking place now. It's not a matter of one being better than the other. It's a matter of charting historical rhythms, which are relevant to today. Because clearly China is becoming a dominant power akin to the dominance it had. The context is different because the global system is so much more advanced than it was, let's say, in 1500, and encompasses the whole globe for that matter. But it's not a question of, one guy's better than the other. David.
First of all, I just thought it was an astounding presentation. I really enjoyed it on all the levels, even the speculative ones. Somehow thinking of the Big Bang Theory as a metaphor was really intellectually exciting. Personally, what I learned was one, and to the question I think that was just asked, a lot of historical revisionism has to be done and has not been done yet in terms of seeing China clearly. And you presented a really good case for that, looking at the ships versus the Viking ships, for example, that are so well touted and how great they are. It just makes me kind of giggle a little bit. The other thing that I learned that I really found interesting was your take on the Second World War as a war of imperialism. Clearly something as minor but important as Italy's misguided expansionism proves that.
Yeah.
But it takes away from, and rightfully redirects, a little bit of the us then understanding of the Second World War II that we easily vilify and say fascism, Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, but not us. We're the saviors, rather than we are the participants as well, securing our own sense of imperialism. I found that really refreshing. The question I really have for you, Matt, comes to I think maybe the kind of heart of this, which is I'm pressing you to give an account for wars of annihilation, because although you mention it and you talk around this, you don't really give us a sense of a rationale for wars of annihilation, and wars of annihilation that might go beyond what we've talked about, even and talk about the Khmer Rouge, or talk about tribal warfare in Africa that know, I mean, we still see this being practiced. And I wonder if you can speculate on this for a minute.
The rationale for why they...
How do they occur? Why do they occur?
Well, yeah, okay. I think in the case of Nazi Germany, it was intentional. I think Hitler and the Nazi leadership intended it. Hitler certainly intended it as early as 1923 when he wrote Mein Kampf. Anybody reading Mein Kampf knows what he's after. And the notion that he was just simply somebody trying to undo the Versailles Treaty and get back Alsace-Lorraine and, get back territory from Poland. No.
But I'm asking for a transnational explanation. Because that's finally where you're going. When you go back to the Big Bang Theory, you're looking at really elemental, deep structure.
Oh, okay.
And I'm
well, if I'm catching your drift, correct me, stop me if I'm not. I think it has to do with what we are as human beings. Human nature is a philosophical concept that's become a scientific concept. And I think we are animals. We have to understand ourselves as being animals, not so that we lose hope in our ability to do good. Because if we lose hope in our ability to do good, all bets are off. But we are animals, and we have impulses toward destructive behavior, whether we're talking about throwing a temper tantrum, getting angry at a computer, I never do that, or annihilating one's neighbors. And if I could just talk about 1941 for a moment, when the Germans swept eastward from the portion of Poland that they occupied at the time toward the Soviet Union, they unleashed. They didn't have to say, okay, Ukrainians, you got some Jewish neighbors, what do you think of them? It just happened. So it's obvious that there are particular circumstances. Eastern Europe is a place where various ethnic groups, each one of which was identified as a racial group, not just an ethnic group. And each one, the minute they were identified as a racial group, they were identified as an inferior racial group. And the minute you do that, you are creating the possibility for violent behavior. And with the arrival of the Germans, who are sending groups of what were called Special Operations Commandos to massacre Jews throughout Eastern Europe. And I will say the Germans killed everybody. They didn't only kill Jews, they killed everybody. But in this particular instance, they're killing Jews. And the animosity felt by Poles, the animosity felt by Ukrainians towards Jews, the animosity felt by Ukrainians towards Poles was high in the 19th and 20th centuries. Not so high in the 16th century, by the way, or the 17th century necessarily, but certainly in the 19th and 20th centuries. And the Germans really only had to push a button, and little towns throughout eastern Poland and the western parts of the Soviet Union, non-Jewish neighbors killed their Jewish neighbors, and did so in the most heinously brutal way, forcing them into synagogues, setting fire to the synagogue, most of them dying inside the synagogue, and if they managed to escape from the synagogue, shooting them in cold blood. So there's something about who we are as human beings in the right circumstances that enables this kind of behavior. Is that Shane?
Yeah. I'm wondering, of course there's a lot going on here, but I wonder if part of the response to Dave's question, I'm wondering if you deal with this at all in your writing, deals with the subtleties of the processes involved in de- and infrahumanization. are likely to make possible some of these heinous acts,
Right.
and how you might deal with this.
Well, I would simply call, what were the words?
Dehumanization or inhumanization.
Yeah. If you define somebody as an Untermensch, which is another wonderful German term, but we have our own word for that, and it's subhuman. Jews were defined as subhuman. For the Germans, everybody east of the Elbe River, in other words, all Slavic peoples were subhuman. The Germans were perfectly willing to move massive quantities of Poles, Russians, to different parts of Eastern Europe in their quest for living space in Eastern Europe. And the only thing that prevented them from completing the process is, and I will say, your point notwithstanding, Dave, is that fortunately the Allies defeated them. Now, I say that knowing that the Allies engaged in heinous things too, but I'm glad the Allies won that. But yeah, dehumanization is a central facet here, and the right circumstances have to exist for dehumanizing attitudes to be activated. I guess is the best way to put that. Yes, Liz.
So history in itself way of illustrating that people want to have the good side and the bad side, and good and bad, and that is a wonderful illustration of human nature. And then when we do talk about war, you just fall into that trap, and comparison is very easy, and the side is very easy, even in itself saying, well, one side won, even if we do think that's correct. And there is a good versus bad trap that we want to humans that could itself be academically mature or steadfast or something along those lines. Do you think integrating other disciplines into history, starting with a single point and then leading up to something else, is this a way of eliminating that good versus bad impulse?
I think there are many ways in which that can be done. You don't have to do history, and you don't have to link history to any other academic discipline to do that. That's something that actually can be done in any class in which issues of this sort fall under its purview. But with respect to linking it to history or linking of any two disciplines, whether they tend to converse a lot or not, is a good in and of itself for an academic program. But I think, and the other issue, I think you're raising several issues here, and trying to sort it out. The other issue is there isn't the good and the bad. I mean, we are constructed, to think, quote unquote, rationally and emotionally. We think emotionally all the time. The notion of cognition being somehow separate from emotion and feeling is, I think, something brain neuroscience could challenge. Joe.
Matt, I have a question because and I'm sure as a historian you're really aware of this. Taking the broad view and kind of putting something like genocide in the context of the Big Bang. And some of the things that you said, like we're talking about human nature, we're talking about the Eastern European genocide just happened, and that there's a human nature propensity toward violence. Those are huge generalizations, right? And a lot had to happen over decades and centuries for something like a genocide to occur, like the one in Bosnia. It happened very quickly for neighbor to turn on neighbor, but huge forces had to be brought to bear.
Oh yeah, that goes back.
Which then muddles the whole idea of human nature, since most people don't kill each other. And most people, most of the time, have wonderful conflict resolution skills. I guess what I'm trying to get is the takeaway of this.
I would say it's not a question of having, well, first of all, you're right, most people don't kill each other.
Yeah.
And I'm not totally sure that's because they have great or highly attuned conflict resolution skills. I think many of the circumstances that would push people toward atrocity or just murder aren't there. And they clearly were there in Bosnia, they're clearly there throughout the Balkans.
So people have a propensity toward a vector toward genocide.
They have a propensity toward engaging in non-peaceful resolution of conflict.
The research that's been done into violence and peacemaking actually pushes strongly against that. The fact that you're able to see communities, like situations, say, like in West Africa. One of the reasons why wars continue right now, one of the reasons why viruses can run roughshod over that area is because the social groupings and organizations and understandings and relationships that manage conflict on a daily basis are gone because of war, because of colonization.
Yeah. Right.
And so we're talking about places that, so I mean, that would push back against that, saying like, no, I mean, societies, we're social beings. We're meant to, we have these things put together. We have these social conflict mechanisms. If we didn't, we wouldn't exist.
Right.
So like, I don't
think what I'm saying challenges that. I think what I'm saying is that under circumstances where the institutions of a society are functioning well, you won't have this. But when they fail, then it's possible that you can end up on a trajectory toward that.
Oh, okay, because what I heard from you before is that the human nature trajectory is toward genocide.
Yeah, we have two trajectories, and circumstances are very much relevant to this. So if you live in a failed society, the possibility of having a robust, peaceful resolution network is hampered, to say the least. But if you live in a society where the norms and the institutions are functioning well, I didn't mean to suggest to the exclusion of circumstances.
Okay. I'm still trying to.
Okay.
So am I.
We're out of time, so if you have additional questions.
Thank you, Matt.